Professor Tedder, I want to turn then to interactions you had, or an interaction you had with the Department of Health in 1983. And I'm going to pick it up, first of all, with your evidence to the Penrose inquiry. So if we could have Lawrence, PRSE 0006049. And if we go to page 96, please. If we go to the bottom of the page, there's you were asked at line 19 about whether you'd met Dr. Wolford, Dr. Diana Wolford, in connection with the whole AIDS problem. And you explained that you had. You referred to the meeting in Washington, which I was asking you about before the break. And then you say after that, and after the meeting, the NIH meeting discussing this, it must have been early 1983. Philip and I, now that's a reference to Dr. Philip Mortimer.
Correct.
Went to DHSS to ask what the plans were for, what was ready, what was going to be the plans for readiness to deal with what, I think I alluded to earlier this morning, was a disease or infection which sounded awfully like hepatitis B in terms of affecting the same group, having the same sort of transmissions. And then you refer to having heard in early 83 or end of 82 about haemophiliacs also being involved. And then if we go down to line 19, you say this. So we felt empowered to go and ask the DHSS what could we do to explore this. And it was as cold a meeting inside the room as it was outside. It was a sort of Cold Spring morning up in one of the DHSS towers, and we were told this was really not any of our business and it was not going to be a problem, and go away and stop rocking the boat. And over the page, you say, both Philip and I, well, I can't speak for Philip, you'd need to ask him, but I was somewhat taken aback and pretty irritated. Excuse me. That was your recollection to the Penrose inquiry. As I understand your witness statement to this inquiry, Professor Tedder, you don't have now particularly distinct recollections of that meeting.
I think I have to say, I think that's right. You know, there's a lot of water under the bridge, I'm afraid. I do remember feeling disappointed that there was not a willingness to go forward and grab opportunities. But, you know, that's a sort of colouring of what I think went on. But if you're asking me who said what, I can't comment.
Now, after that meeting, you wrote to Dr. Wolford. I'll come to that letter in a couple of minutes. But I just want to ask you first about some observations you make in your statement. So if we could have WITN 3436003 back on screen. And if we could go, please, to page 18. You say this in paragraph 54. I was not aware of plans to deal with a new and emerging infection and cannot comment on what, if any, processes were then in place. In the early 1980s, hepatitis B was a disease which caused a clearly apparent acute illness presenting as jaundice and hepatitis in gay men. Had there been appropriate public health surveillance for this, it would have opened up the immediate possibility of using the same approach in the same population, looking for the disease of gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome, GRIDS. This would have given the absolute substrate for investigating the emergence of HIV disease in the same population. Now, just two questions arising out of that paragraph, Professor Tedder. Firstly, what kind of public health surveillance did you have in mind that could have been appropriate for hepatitis B?
I think notification to an organisation who would be able to look for further transmission of infection from the infected individual, provide protection and to those who might have been exposed. If the time was right, there are options for passive antibody given to people who've had an exposure to hepatitis B, but also the opportunity to immunize the at-risk populations, and I use the at-risk very specifically in this case, the sexual partners of, and hopefully to encourage a degree of behavioural change to prevent onwards transmission of hepatitis B. All of those could be offered partly from a laboratory who had a central role in knowing where these acute infections were, relating it to the GUM clinics or the health clinics, and the health clinics and GM clinics themselves would have had a role in passing that information back to their patients and the people seeing them, and trying to suggest that maybe they modify their behaviour.
And there was no such system in place that you were aware of at the time?
Well, I think there were, but I wasn't aware of it being truly effective. But that's just, you know, that's me as a clinical virologist.
And then can you assist in understanding the reference in that last sentence to the absolute substrate? What did you mean by that?
Well, I think what I'm suggesting, that if you put that in place and having a mechanism for surveillance, interaction with the risk populations, this would have given one an opportunity to say, hey chaps, we've talked to you about, or hey folks, because we don't put a gender on it, we've talked to you about hepatitis B. Just be careful, because there's something out there which we think has a similar role of transmission, and if you can protect yourself by your behavior from getting hepatitis B, you may also benefit from getting infected by whatever the cause of this new and emerging disease is.
And then if we can look at the next 3 paragraphs, please. You say this: even today, with the advent of COVID, when I was able to produce within the first few weeks of the emerging coronavirus epidemic serological tests which could identify both acute and past infections with SARS-CoV-2 and offered these to the government, they were entirely disregarded. The method for using dried blood spots, DBS, and remote sampling for population studies was also disregarded. My reflection suggests that the pressure to develop antigen-based and PCR-based diagnostics for detecting the infection in the acute phase distracted people from the value of having serological tests which could be used on a population basis to map the transmission of this virus within the population as a whole. Interestingly, we seem to be running through a similar scenario 36 years later. It was very similar to the response I received when I told DH in 2020 that what we needed for COVID was an antibody test. I think people focus on finding a test to the virus and forget the value of having a good serological test for antibody against an emerging infection, which facilitates determining when, where, and how a virus may be passing in the host population. Now, if we just go back to the previous page, we have those on screen. Now, I'm not going to ask you to talk in any level of detail about your interactions with the government in relation to COVID. We're not the COVID inquiry, and there is a COVID inquiry that has recently begun. But it's more the reflections that you're able to draw based upon interactions back in the early 80s with the government in relation to AIDS, and then interactions more recently, as you describe here, with the government in relation to COVID. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on why there seems to be, as you describe it, a short-sightedness about the value of certain kinds of tests and certain kinds of response?
I think there are 2 components in an answer to that. If I can get the trivial component away first, which is there is a great reliance by DHSC and people in that area of authority to distance themselves from an academic who comes and says, I've got a damn good test and this will work, because it's not commercial. And to get a test of the sort of ability that we have, you'd have to get it commercialized, and length of time, you have to find a partner and so on. And it means that your technology is not absorbed in the response. Now, partly, an antibody test doesn't help you really to make an acute diagnosis unless you have an antibody test which can measure the presence of the antibody in the acute infection, which is IgM antibody. And that is what we have for COVID. We have an antibody test which can identify past and acute infections and can be delivered by a dried blood spot, all of which enable you to say, Mrs. Smith over in Little Wapping under Lyme somewhere, I'm going to send you a card, drop 2 drops or 3 drops of blood on there, and we'll tell you whether you've had COVID or whatever infection. And that, to me, as a virologist and somebody who is an old-fashioned animal who likes to measure antibody, is an alternative to the modern approach where you have to take a throat swab or nose swab and you have to send it to a laboratory to do a PCR. I'm not decrying PCR because I love PCRs and we've developed them over the years, but the people forget that an antibody will map your transmission of an agent in the community rather than having to get acute infections from everybody. For every acute one infection you have, you may have 15 or 20 people who've been infected. And if you're going to do a population of 500 people, it's much easier to do 500 dry blood spots than 500 PCRs where you each have got to go up and take the appropriate sample at the appropriate time. People forget that serology is a good way of determining the evolution of an epidemic into a population, the distillation of the virus going through the population.
Now, if we then turn to back into 1983, following the meeting that you and Dr. Mortimer had with the department, if we go to the letter that you then wrote to Dr. Wolford, DHSC 0003824_164. It's a letter the 20th of May 1983 to Dr. Wolford, and you refer in the first sentence to the meeting. Thank you for seeing Dr. Morter and myself last week. I gather Dr. Catterall's already written to Dr. Graveney. I expect you, like I have seen a copy of his letter. It is, I believe, a reasonable statement of intent. However, as a virologist, I should like to make a number of comments on the whole problem of AIDS, not merely related to a GUM framework. This condition is likely to be caused by an infectious agent or agents. Its epidemiology bears a striking similarity to hepatitis B. Since hepatitis B became a growth industry, we've gained a great deal of knowledge about the infection and about the illness by study of a small epidemiologically easily identified patient group, the male homosexual. In the UK, where hepatitis B is not a major health problem, it has still proved possible to examine the problem of this disease by examining this group of patients. AIDS is essentially limited at present to the same easily identified group. So although AIDS has many wider implications covering, for example, the fields of blood transfusion and risks to medical staff, it's only by detailed study of the homosexual patient that will be likely to make a significant contribution to an understanding of its etiology. The work on AIDS covers 3 main aspects. To be successful, I am certain that a multidisciplinary approach is vital. Also, since the evidence is that the disease is becoming established in the UK, I think that it's necessary to set up this project now. Now, just pausing there, can you recall, it's a difficult question, I suspect, so many years after the event, but what evidence it was you had in mind that the disease was becoming established in the UK? What kind of information you might have had which led you to make that observation?
Well, it's 39 years ago. It is a bit difficult to recall. And I should think it is, again, coming back to the similarity of disease patterns in the population of hepatitis B and how you would control hepatitis B is identifying where it is, transmission events, counselling people who've been infected, counselling people who are infected. Hepatitis B, of course, we had a vaccine. For this, we don't have, even now we don't have a vaccine. So it comes back to counselling people and giving people good advice. And that's really, ultimately, when you've got something new in the community, that's what you have to do.
And would it be right to understand, because you'd gone to this meeting with Dr. Mortimer, we haven't said who Dr. Mortimer was, he was based at PHLS, so he would have had access to whatever data PHLS had by this stage about the extent of infection with AIDS?
He would have, but don't forget, PHLS, like the Department of Health, is split into bits, and there may not necessarily be routine transmission of information from one group to another. I mean, Philip, who's still a good friend of mine, is a medical virologist. And we as virologists may or may not be privy to what epidemiologists have or want, or what clinicians dealing with the patient groups have or want. So if one could break it down and get people to talk to each other without feeling of, there's a sectarian limit to where I am, and somebody else over there, and say, well, it's all our problem, let's try and solve it for the betterment of people. You need to get talking, and you need to break down barriers, and that's barriers both up to government, down from government, and at the level of people who are dealing with individuals and populations.
And then returning to the letter, you outlined 3 areas of work that you thought was important to undertake. I'm not going to read those out, but we can see the heading, Patients, Immunology, Virology. If we go over the page and just pick it up in the 3rd line, you say this. If there is a single novel etiological agent causing AIDS, and if this agent is present as a viremia, likely since factor 8 is implicated, it may well be amenable to the sort of approach which identified hepatitis B and the human parvovirus. So again, just pausing there, what can you just help us understand the statement that it was likely to be viremia because factor 8 was implicated?
Well, it feels like if you gave the pattern of this, not the clinical features, but if you gave the pattern of this disease and transmission events and who it affected and who it didn't, you'd say, well, that's a transmissible agent, sexually transmitted, probably causing persistent infection, and persistent infection is leading to disease. And there may be an illness of acute infection which we don't know about. And that is how I think a clinical virologist would have thought about that. And then, having thought about that, would say, well, we need to have a way of testing. We need to develop diagnostic assays. And that includes virus assays and includes looking for virus, literally looking for virus, and also antibody tests.
And then we can see in the next paragraph, I don't need to read it out, but you set out the kind of support in terms of funding that you were looking to the Department of Health to provide, or inviting the Department of Health to consider providing, to enable the work that you described there to be undertaken. As I understand from your statement, although the document suggests that some funding was received from the medical, or may have been received from the Medical Research Council, there was no funding that was provided in response to this by the Department of Health itself.
That's a difficult question for me to reflect on, as I say, nearly 40 years ago. I'm not sure. I think we were put forward with support to the MRC to seek funding with Professor Adler, who was the GUM physician or GUM physician lead in our local clinic. If you're asking me exactly what returns we got, I'm afraid I really can't recall. All I know is we were busy the whole time providing testing for anybody who wanted it. And that's all we could do at that time.
The letter you wrote to Dr. Wolford was, I think, the same date as the publication by Montagnier in Paris of the LAV1 data. In relation to that, did you have any knowledge in advance that was going to be published, or any knowledge in advance of what had been found? And do you have any, sorry, we can take that down. Do you have any recollection of what your response was, or a reaction, or the reaction of colleagues to the Paris publication?
No, because I was a serological my activity was a serological component of a response to this new agent. We did not have the facility in the first instance for propagating the virus in tissue culture. We developed that, but we certainly never had the expertise to make primary isolates, and that was not our remit. That fell to Robin Weiss and his colleagues, and indeed gifted LAV1 from Montagnier.
We'll come on to that. Just then, sticking with the interactions that you'd had with the Department of Health, if we go back to your statement, WITN 3436003, page 22, you say this in paragraphs 69 and 70.
Yes.
While the wording that was used in the meeting with Dr. Wolford may not have been specifically stop rocking the boat, the sense that I got was that the DHSS did not regard testing as a problem. She indicated that they would not provide the necessary funding. The issue was that by early 1983, we knew that we needed to do something quickly. I think this is why I found the response from the DHSS particularly difficult. I felt that we were ready to go and do something to help, but the DHSS was saying that it was not really their business to fund it. It was worth remembering that by this stage, because of my work on HTLV1-2, the modelling indicated we could easily make an assay for HTLV3B. So is it right to understand from your evidence, both to Penrose and here, and the fact of the letter that you wrote, that your sense was that the department was not responding with a sufficient sense of urgency, a sufficient sense of the importance of addressing it?
It's difficult to reflect on that, what I actually felt at the time. I think it's when you have a sense of, I've got something which could really be helpful, and I'm able to produce this, look, I've done this, and you get a feeling of, well, that's all right, but it's, so not exactly so what, but didn't get a feeling of, gosh, that really could be important. Let's take that forward. Now, all I can say, Philip and I would have felt disappointed.
And then if we go to paragraph 81 of your statement, page 27, you say this: in respect to funding, I do have a recollection of a meeting with someone from the DHSS sometime later, I think around 1984,
Yes.
when we had serological tests. It might have been at an MRC meeting, although I'm unsure. I remember there being someone from the Department of Health who said words to the effect of, haven't we done well? I recall seeing Professor Weiss bristle at the suggestion. He responded that the department had done absolutely nothing. I remember the man backing away from Professor Weiss. It was completely incorrect for him to say we, as we'd essentially been forced to fund the entire programme by other means, from internal funding, funds to me and my GIL post at the time, through the Health Authority or possibly through the MRC. Do you have any further recollection of that later meeting, or does this paragraph essentially describe what you can recall?
I do think you should ask Robin Weiss what his recollection of that is. I have never seen him be so irritated, in a perfectly gentlemanly manner, but just saying this is not on what you're saying, you haven't done anything, how dare you say, haven't we done well? You should be saying, haven't you done well?
And then can I just ask you on the issue of public health funding more generally, to look at something you said to the Archer inquiry. So ARCH 5011, please, page 160. Now, just to put it in context, this part of your evidence takes place as part of a discussion about self-sufficiency and the upgrading of BPL. The chair of the inquiry says this at lines 4 to 9. I think we're very conscious of the dangers of hindsight, but what's been suggested is that it was a little late by 1974 to think about upgrading the facilities for processing this. Elstree, for example, was a long way behind what its capacity could have been if there'd been timely investment. And then this is your answer. I think that's probably fair. I think if one blames anybody, it is the financial structures in this country which sometimes don't put money into health service emergencies. And certainly one didn't recognise this as an emergency until much, much later, or it became an emergency because of a failure to invest. And then the Chair's comment, of course, the time to provide for something is before it becomes an emergency, and you say, indeed, yes. Now, I'm not asking you about the issue of funding for the redevelopment of BPL. It's the general observation you make there about the financial structures in this country which sometimes don't put money into health service emergencies, or perhaps don't put them sufficiently far in advance. Again, are there any observations drawing on the many decades in which you've been involved in research and scientific developments? Any further observations you would have about that?
No, it feels very reminiscent of what I've said currently about the serological diagnostics for SARS-CoV-2. I can understand the reluctance of people in the position of authority to be seen to be favouring an independent sector approach from an academic or a group of academics who say they can do something well. And I suppose I can understand it, but speaking as somebody who could have done something for SARS-CoV-2, we still have the best test out there which predicts neutralizing antibody, and can we find anybody in this country to manufacture it? No. It's sad. I don't think it will make a great deal of difference because the commercial assays are out there now, but you know, we were ready to run with it last year.
So would it be right to understand from your evidence that both then and now it might be thought that there's an infrastructure problem in terms of what one does and how one makes the best of the developments that scientists can make, and how that is then put into practical implementation?
I mean, that's a difficult question to answer because there is a competitive air in academia. You know, academic centres will always want to see their centre benefiting as opposed to others benefiting. So it's not exactly a neutral environment in which you come forward with, say, I've got something which actually matters. In generality, it would be nice to feel that if you came up with something which was really good, people would listen to you. I mean, look what Mitchell had to do with the Spitfire. You know, he had to take it out and fly it and demonstrate it, and then its worth was recognized, and so on went forwards. That's perhaps a very personal analogy because I'm an aviator, but it would be nice to feel that there is a way of engaging with government and engaging with DHSC which doesn't fall into I'm breaching a zone because I want my academia to be recognized above everything else, which is, I think, how many people perceive academics. It's not actually that. Sometimes it's the academic group will have something which really has a benefit for society, and it's finding a mechanism to enable that. And that sounds awfully pretentious, and I'm not trying to lecture people up there how to deal with this, but it just would be nice to have a mechanism where you could have a non-confrontational discussion with DHSC or somebody say, look, actually, what about this? This matters. And, you know, we almost got it right. We have had it right in some times with people, but it'd be nice to have it out in the open and a mechanism for doing that.
Can I then ask you to look at a document from October 83? So this is moving on or moving away from the interactions with Dr. Wolford or others. It's CBLA 0001749. These are the minutes of a meeting of the MRC Working Party on AIDS. The date is the 10th of October 1983, and we can see there the list of members, departmental observers, and then by invitation, and you're there identified as being present by invitation. If we could go to page 3. Paragraph C, etiology. It says the etiological background to AIDS was considered with passing allusion to the antigen overload hypothesis. An increased microbiological load with multiple infections associated with active virus replication in the host was thought a possible mechanism for immunodeficiency. The more widely held view that AIDS was due to a novel AIDS agent was also discussed. And then there's a further discussion, which I'm not going to read out. And we see there again the reference to the analogy with hepatitis B, however. And then the next paragraph says, retroviruses were considered. It was noted that HTLV was a possible candidate on the basis of its known tropism for T helper cells. However, a critical evaluation of the data led to the view that it was more probably an opportunist, was unlikely to be the etiological agent. And then this, the assumption that the agent was necessarily a virus was challenged, and the need to keep an open mind on organisms such as protozoa was stressed. Systematic antimicrobial therapy might provide leads on such agents. It was noted that blood product-associated cases could enable some of these alternative hypotheses to be tested. Now, given that it's October 1983 by this time, it may be suggested that it's surprising that there is challenge to the assumption that the agent was necessarily a virus. Do you have any recollection now of from whom that challenge came? The list of members is, if we go back to the first page.
No, I don't, but looking at it, there is always an interplay between epidemiologists and microbiologists, and there's also an interplay between microbiologists of the large organisms, the parasitologists, the medium size, which are the bacteria, and those who deal with the small things, which are virologists. And there will always be a discussion with something new. If the pattern of the disease fits with hepatitis B, as I think it did, those of us who are virologists will say, well, that feels awfully like something we've seen before in the forms of transmission of hepatitis B. The parasitologists and the bacteriologists will say, well, hang on a tick. Okay, we hear what you say, but how are you sure that it's not a bacterium? Are you sure it's not a parasite or a protozoan? And the answer is no, but one's overall feeling as a virologist is that this fits very well. And then you would need to ask a parasitologist whether this fits well with the parasitological etiology or bacteriological etiology. Does that answer your question?
Well, I think probably it's best you're able to, given that I was asking whether you had any recollection of from whom the challenge came, and 40-odd years later, 39 years later, that
okay,
might be a
simple answer, ma'am, is no, I don't recall. But I think I can see the reasoning behind it. Sorry.
I'm going to move now to the topic of donor selection. So at this point in 1983, there is as yet no test in relation to HTLV3 HIV. We'll come on shortly to your work in developing a test. And so donor selection was a means of reducing the risk of transmission through blood. And so I want to go back to what you said to the Archer inquiry on this topic, ARCH 5011. And if we go to page 154, and it picks up on the evidence you've already given us earlier, Professor, about Dr. Dane, but in a little more detail. So if we pick it up at line 15, and again, the context of the discussion had been about self-sufficiency, but you say this at line 15. Well, I think this probably sets me apart from a number of people, but I think the question of blood products and blood safety, one of the most important mantras I still believe, even in this day and age, is know your donor. Know your donor and know the infection risks in your donor. If I can just step sideways from your question for a moment and give you a current example. We have good British donors who go abroad and they go to some area of the world where there's something else out there that we don't know of, for example, malaria, dengue, which is a virus infection, not terribly nice. Rabies, we've had transmissions of rabies in Europe and other virus infections. And then line 6, these sorts of issues show that you need to know your donor and you need to know the environment in which your donor is, where they come from, where they're travelling. Obviously, it's not xenophobic. We restrict people who've been in areas of the world where these microbial infections are common. That becomes an extension of the concept to be self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency was driven not so much, in my experience, was not driven by the financial requirements or ease of manufacture or trying to protect a home market. It was just merely a principle that it's much better to take your blood and tissues and organs from donors whom you know where they've been, they are in your country, they will not harbour something which is not enzootic, endemic, whatever, whether it's in animals or humans in this country, and they will not bring something in. That is the principle of self-sufficiency. And then you tell us in your statement, that, and have told us before, this was a view you'd effectively inherited from Dr. Dane. Now, in the UK then, even in the UK, so leave aside the question of importation of concentrates from America, to know your donor, would it be right to understand that there has to be some attempt to assess and understand the behavioural and travel history of the donor, and questions have to be asked, therefore, of the donor?
You've put two things together, travel history and knowing about it both. You need to know what behaviour, what travel, where and why a donor has been in order to have a reasonable aspiration of what the risks are.
And sometimes those might be questions that are easy to ask in the environment of a donor centre, but sometimes they may be questions that are difficult to ask, in particular if it brings into play issues about lifestyle, homosexuality, drug use, and so on.
Yes, I mean this is one of the difficult issues, and the most graphic example would be a husband and wife being bullied by friends to go and give blood. So then the husband is asked personal questions about sexual preferences or sexual exposure, and it's very difficult. You can imagine a situation where somebody who doesn't disclose a risk to his spouse has to disclose it or should disclose it to whoever is asking the question. So therefore, you need to have the question to the donor being given in a controlled environment without other people listening, including spousal contact. And that can be difficult.
And we've heard evidence in the inquiry that within the North London Regional Transfusion Centre, they were able to develop certain initiatives, in particular a questionnaire, which would mean someone would still give their blood, but they would be able to indicate privately on a document that their blood should not then be used for transfusion, but could be used for research.
Well, we know, don't we, that not everybody actually got the questionnaire. So it actually has to be more proactive than that. It has to be a controlled environment in which you have a question and answer session between an examiner and the donor.
If we go back to your statement then, please, WITN 3436003. I'm sorry, WITN 3436003. There's nothing on my screen. Oh, I'm sorry, you're waiting for the page. My apologies. Page 36. I'm sorry, Lawrence. So bottom of page 36, paragraph 108, you make the point that we've just been exploring about being able to assess behavioural history and travel history, central component of blood safety. All comes down to, do you know your donor? Do you trust them? Are they telling you the truth? And then if we go over the page, you say this in paragraph 109, I did hold this view in the 1970s and 80s, and I believe that reasonable and sensible efforts were made to ensure this in the UK. And then you say this, although my own view when AIDS emerged would have been to seek to exclude from the outset all men who had sex with men, I do understand why this was not the initial response based on the information as it was being received from the US, where the target for exclusion was the homosexual man with multiple / mini sexual partners / contacts. Now, I'm not going to take you through the AIDS leaflets. You've seen them for the purpose of your statement, and the inquiry's looked at them on a number of occasions. But we know that first AIDS leaflet sought to discourage people who have, present tense, many sexual partners, men who have many sexual partners with other men. And as I understand it from your statement, your view was that the better course would have been to ensure that all those who had had sex with a man at any point in time would be excluded. Yes. So although, as I understand it, you're not critical of the efforts that were made, the initial donor leaflet, at least viewed in retrospect through your statement, in your view, didn't go far enough.
I think we had discussions, and if you're asking me when and where, I can't recall. But we, as a virological fraternity, talking to the transfusion service, would have preferred to have any man who's had sex with another man, not asking whether it was receptive or insertive, but just if you've had sex with another man, full stop, we would prefer you to absent yourself from being a donor. However you do that and however you deliver that policy is open to a lot of discussion, but that is ultimately the end stage. You want that person to not present themselves as a donor, and preferably not present themselves for a donor to be turned away or to have to step down, because that puts a lot of potential strain on the family relationship.
And you referred in your statement to a meeting that you attended with Professor Contreras and Professor Barbara, as they now are, with representatives of the gay community in London, and there was initial concern expressed at what was seen to be potentially discriminatory towards those who were gay. But is it right to understand that as the matter was talked through, those concerns you were able to be addressed, and you describe in your statement there being, at least in relation to the North London Regional Transfusion Centre, a constructive relationship with the gay community?
Yes, I wish I could remember the name of the young man who became quite a friend of us at the transfusion service, and it was actually the inception of the Terence Higgins Trust, which became very much a mechanism for interaction between young men who have sex with young men and the community, whichever part of the community outside. So there was a meaningful and useful interrelationship, exchange of views and advice, bilateral advice, how to find the best way forwards.
And then if we just look at minutes of a meeting of the working group on AIDS, it's at DHSC 0002251_011. Sorry, these aren't the minutes of a meeting. This is a minute dated the 27th of November 1984. The date's on the second page. We don't need to go to it. From Emmy Abrahams within the Department of Health to Dr. Harris, who we know was a deputy CMO. But it refers to a meeting of the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service Working Group on AIDS. And in terms of test kits, we'll come back to that, but I just wanted to pick up what's said at paragraph 1, little Roman 4. They were not in favour of closer questioning of donors to see if they were homosexual, etc. They were in favour of a local session leaflet, such as is used now, which gets people to answer a list of questions, amongst which are the AIDS questions. There was concern that too closer questioning might be counterproductive. I don't know whether you can help us in understanding the thinking there. Why would too closer questioning be counterproductive?
Well, we're in a similar scenario today where there's not enough blood to supply the needs of the NHS in the UK. And I think there was a concern. You could interpret counterproductive in two ways, and you're asking me now, and I'm not quite sure what we meant by that. There would be the counterproduction of making people not disclose because their family were present and didn't want to disclose that they weren't fit to be donors. So that was one counterproduction of not having the right mechanism for asking. And the other is that, as we are at the moment, that we have a shortage of blood to supply the requirements of the health service in the UK this week. And that close questioning might lead people to say, oh, you know, I went up to give my blood and I was put in a room and I was questioned for 15 minutes as to whether I was a man who had sex with a man, or etc., or whether I was doing recreational drugs, and I'm not going to go back and give blood again. That sort of approach, that sort of I'm not sure it's right to call it aggressive questioning, but that in-depth questioning in front of other members of the family might mean that your donor panel becomes reduced and you lose people who are really perfectly valid, good donors. And it's a question of how you deliver what you think is safely in a way that's going to not have counterproduction, not become unsafe in terms of losing too many donors. And you need to explore it with people. You almost need to explore it with donors and ask them how would they prefer to be questioned about this. You can give people a leaflet, but as we know, some of the leaflets weren't seen, they weren't interpreted properly. And at the end of the day, it's got to be safe for the recipients of the blood and blood components. There's no question of that.
Do you know whether there was ever any systematic attempt to assess or model what might be the effect on the blood supply, or was it really at a level of there just being a general fear that there might be adverse consequences for the blood supply?
If you're asking were there any objective attempts to use different approaches and measure the outcome, I'm not aware of them. I think it was a general concern that, as we see at the moment, it is sometimes difficult to have sufficient donors prepared to come forwards to support the needs of the NHS. And then you know, loss of 5% of the donors because of taking, if your approach to donor questioning was unfriendly and aggressive, you can see that donors could take umbrage, lose 5% of your donor problems. We're already 17% short of what we need. It would be, you know, it would be, it's a risk either way, and you've got to find a way to protect people. That's what we have to do in a broader sense.
Going in terms of questioning people in a way that's aggressive or confrontational, of course, it ought to be perfectly feasible to know your donor, yeah, to ask your donor questions in a way that is friendly, non-adversarial, and which explains the importance of why these questions are asked and the importance of answering them truthfully.
Whether it's where your recent travel has been or whatever. And this would be central to David Dane's mantra, know your donor. Get to know your donor.
And then just one final document on this topic, which is one of the documents that you saw this morning, Professor Tedder. It's DHSC 0002249_026. And it's a transcript from the World This Weekend on BBC Radio 4, 18th of November 1984. We can see the trigger for you and then indeed Dr. Gunson then being interviewed appears to be the reports from Australia that there had been the deaths of 3 babies who'd received transfusions of blood donated by a male homosexual suspected of suffering from AIDS. And if we go over the page, we pick it up halfway down the page. There's reference to the work that you were undertaking to establish a test, and then you're asked whether you felt following events in Australia that the risk was such that homosexuals in this country should be banned from becoming blood donors. And I just want to read what you said, because obviously this was relatively contemporaneous. This was what you were saying in November 84. No, not a ban so much as a self-inflicted ban, perhaps, rather than a state-controlled ban. One would hope that the transfusion centres would educate their donor panel sufficiently to make it very apparent and easily apparent to the donors why they should not give and how socially irresponsible it would be of them to continue giving if they were male homosexuals. And then the question, so you're saying then that no practising male homosexuals in this country should now give blood, Your answer, yes, and this has been Department of Health policy in this country for a number of months now. Question, do you suspect, though, that they are still giving blood? And then your answer, yes, I know without doubt that male homosexuals continue to give blood. It is particularly important when you have a blood team going to a place of work, like, for example, a factory, and you have half a dozen men coming up to give blood, and they all read the AIDS leaflet, and if somebody then turns around and walks out from the public area, all his mates will say, oh, didn't know about Fred being gay. Now, this is a very real problem, and the way the American clinics have got around this is by having nurse attendants or physician attendants who interview on a one-to-one basis the donor, and they can ask them in private. And indeed, in New York, where infected donors are probably of the greatest prevalence anywhere in the world, they've enabled the system to work whereby the donor comes up, gives his blood, and then at the same time as giving the blood says whether it's to be used for research purposes or whether it can be used for human therapeutic purposes. And just pausing there, and the evidence we've heard, Professor Tedder, is that that was the system that was then deliberately modelled on the New York system that was introduced specifically into the North London Regional Transfusion Centre. And then your answer continues, this allows the homosexual to have his blood taken to make some contribution, if you like, towards research, but marks the serum and the blood product as not being fit for human consumption. And then you're asked about the leaflet and whether that's enough. And you say this, well, at the risk of making myself unpopular with my colleagues in the blood transfusion service, I think it is very clear that the exposure of donors to the AIDS leaflet is insufficient, because I myself have 2 male friends who are not gay, incidentally, but have acted as blood donors, and in both instances, neither of them were asked, nor did they see the AIDS leaflet. Now, that is worrying if that can happen to 2 friends out of the small number of blood donors who are my personal friends. And then over the page, you were asked your view on the position in Australia, and you say this, in the United Kingdom, the proportion of blood donors who may be infected with the AIDS virus is vanishingly small. That is true of 1984. Whether it will still be true in 1985 or 86, I think, is questionable. It must be seen only as a matter of time before British blood products and British donors become contaminated with the virus. And then just pausing there, because the interview goes on then to interview Dr. Harold Gunson. 18th of November 1984, you would in fact, I think, have known by this time, because of your testing of Dr. Ludlam's patients, the Edinburgh cohort, that British blood products had been contaminated with HIV.
Yes, I mean, I think Professor Ludlam's problem up north was not, I don't think any of us anticipated that. He certainly didn't. His aspiration was to show that his recipient panel was clear of HIV infection, and this did not take into account the high and expanding frequency of use of injectable drug use for recreational purposes on the east coast of Scotland, to the east of Edinburgh, where there was quite a body of recreational drug usage, which of course had been, I use it in the non-inflammatory sense, exposed by and used by HIV to become established in that population.
And we'll come back later, no doubt this afternoon, to further issues relating to Professor Ludlam and the testing. So I'm going to move now to the development of the HTLV3 test. Rather than start that with 4 minutes to go before lunch, shall we break now for lunch, and I'll start it after lunch?
Well, it's quite a big issue, so let's take a break now, shall we, until 25 past 2. 25 past 2.
Thank you, sir.